Good evening and welcome. You're watching Left, Right and Centre with me, Sanket Upadhyay. Tracking two stories right here. Story number one, why are Tamil refugees fleeing Sri Lanka? There was a case which was reported this morning, those pictures that you can see on your screen right now, and many more lining up. There is a crisis in Sri Lanka. What is that crisis and how will a refugee situation be controlled? All that and much more will be discussed in just a short moment. We'll explain what are the reasons behind this and then solutions. Story number two, there is a new entrance test for universities. You see, what started happening was that different boards for class 12th examinations had their own system of marking and gradation. So as a result, what happened was that some were lenient, some were strict. So those who were lenient gave everybody 100% marks in class 12th exams. And thus the cutoff in, say, a Delhi university or other central universities reached an obnoxious 100%. So the central government has now decided to get an entrance test for university. So it can be RIP cutoffs. But is that necessarily the best thing? As a concept, it may be great, but could it have its faults which need to be rectified? We speak to former Delhi University Vice Chancellor Dinesh Singh, who puts it in perspective, and I would say he's spot on. But first, story number one, let's get you more details on what exactly has happened in Sri Lanka. So, Lankans are trying to flee their country to escape unemployment as well as food shortage. The Indian Coastguard apprehended 6 Lankans on Tuesday. Food, fuel, medicine supply, and this is the reason why they're doing this, has all been disrupted. All of it has been disrupted. Protests and deaths have also broken out in long lines for fuel. All of this is happening in Sri Lanka. 3 elderly people were reported to have dropped dead in fuel queues. Soldiers have been posted at fuel stations now because of the crisis. The country is struggling to pay for essential imports. Prices of essential commodities have skyrocketed. Complaints of stockpiling, inefficient distribution. Foreign exchange is now down 70% over 2 years. Tourism, the country's mainstay, has dried up during the pandemic. Reckless infrastructure financing caused a debt surge. Depleting reserves forced a currency devaluation. So this is the crisis because of which the refugee crisis has emanated. Now let's tell you what India is doing as far as this crisis is concerned. India has extended a credit line to Sri Lanka. In March, $1 billion credit line for food, medicine and procurement. In February, $500 million loan to help purchase petroleum products. India also says that Lanka is integral to neighborhood first policy and we will always be a reliable partner for Sri Lanka. But apart from that, there is a refugee crisis which looms, and that too in the area where Sri Lankan Tamils exist or where they stay. That's where the refugee crisis is happening, and which is why 6 people were intercepted. Now what is Lanka saying? The country, they say, is to work with IMF to help solve the economic crisis. Lanka has set a target of cutting trade deficit by about 14% this year, and the country needs $6.9 billion to service the debt this year. That's how high it really is. Let me introduce our guest this evening. We have joining us from Colombo, Rohan Samarajiva. He's a Sri Lankan policy analyst, as well as Mr. N. Ram, Director of the Hindu Publishing Group. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. We'll begin with you, Mr. Rohan. So this crisis, now one is a crisis that Sri Lanka handles on the debt front, the economic crisis, and the other is a refugee crisis, which will then have an impact on a neighboring India. How do you make sure that it does not become so bad that Sri Lankans have to choose or decide to flee the country?
Well, if you look at similar cases, Venezuela, Lebanon, these are extreme cases. We hopefully will not get to that dire a situation. but you do have people moving out, and Sri Lanka has been losing people, economic refugees, basically, for a significant period of time. But this has been middle-class people who've been mostly leaving the country. Sri Lanka is, I think you know, one of the most unequal country in terms of income, in terms of the Gini coefficient. We are much worse than India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and all these countries. So I think the poorest group have been hit extremely hard by the mismanagement of the present crisis. And many of the poor actually are unable to leave. But those who have family and relationships in India and who actually are close to the coastline, because we have refugees there, political refugees from the 90s in Mandapan and various places who have the relationships are likely to begin moving out if we do not get control of this crisis.
Correct. Mr. N. Ram, what's your view? How do you think, do you feel that this can be handled? And Kasturi, she's a noted actor, is now also with us. Thank you very much, Kasturi, for joining us. Mr. N. Ram, what's your view? Do you think that this crisis can increase? And if it does, then how does India handle it? One is economic crisis. The other is the refugee crisis.
Well, so far, Sanket, we learned that 16 people have come over, including small children and women. And when they were interviewed, they said, we didn't have food, we didn't eat since yesterday, and so on. So it's exactly what Mr. Samarajiva mentioned, the poorest sections hit. But as for the handling of the pandemic and the crisis that came after that, it's been building up for a long time. I think there has clearly been misgovernance of a special kind, among other things, because the army personnel are being used for civilian tasks, including in the latest instance for fuel, to oversee fuel distribution and so on. And the pandemic response, the green agriculture policies and all this. And this is very troubling, particularly for the Tamil people, when so much has happened in their lives in fairly recent memory.
Correct.
So I think but apart from that, there is a big crisis. I just read that the dollar, the Sri Lankan rupee has fallen so badly. One US dollar is right now about 275 rupees.
Oh, that's terrible.
Which is alarming. And you already mentioned, the debt servicing burden, nearly 7 billion. Actually, India has provided so far, $2.4 billion in different ways. So, apart from a few 100,000 doses of vaccines, and China has provided about $2.8 billion US, and Sri Lanka expects more. But it is a full-fledged economic crisis because the export earnings, foreign exchange earning sectors have been badly hit by the pandemic. I don't know enough about how it was handled on the ground in the beginning because they had a lot of vaccines from China and to some extent from India. But economically, certainly, with all respect to the Sri Lankan political process, there's been misgovernance of a special kind, and I would throw the blame at the door of the president. It's become a very presidential system. For example, a highly irrational decision was made to ban chemical fertilizers, and the harvest was badly hit. And another important thing, when you talk about the plight of the poor, Sri Lanka had enviable social standards, social indicators earlier, comparable to Kerala and even ahead, life expectancy at birth. It's the envy of many Indian states, particularly southern Indian states,
Correct.
And it came to that. But there's no public distribution system. Healthcare is still in pretty good shape, basic primary healthcare, but the public distribution system was done away with in the process of liberalization, not this government, but much earlier, the late 70s, I believe. So I think all this has contributed to this crisis. But on your question, I think India must be very sympathetic. You shouldn't get alarmed by this is not a huge number coming in. You must treat them with respect, treat them with sympathy, support them. Obviously, nobody wants to encourage a big, an exodus. a refugee crisis, but it's not going to reach that stage.
Of course. I mean, it's not going to reach that stage. And Kasturi, you feel that a sympathetic view is really going to help. It will also show that India is there to extend that helping hand, not just financially, but in actual human, in a person, on a person to person, or that human touch. You can have perhaps some refugee camps set up while there is a crisis which looms.
Thank you
As
for
Mr. Ram
having
said,
me.
people are hungry.
Yeah, thank you for having me on this discussion. A quick word of why my views will be relevant here, because I'm being introduced as an actor. Let me introduce myself also as somebody with deep and long connections to Sri Lanka. I have a brother currently in Norway who actually was in the war. There's a lot of history back and forth, which is too long for me to explain. But let me just say, I'm not an actor commenting on Sri Lanka here right now. I have some information. I'm informed about it, if you will. So I will start by saying,
actors are informed people.
Well,
don't look at me calling you an actor as some sort of a
no. It's for people. It's for people watching NDTV and they're thinking, what is Kasturi doing here? So,
yes.
Here's the thing. I do agree with Mr. Ram said it very succinctly. These are human beings and they are fleeing death and starvation. They're fleeing hyperinflation at this point. And it's not a choice. A lot of these people don't even have the choice to leave. And those who leave, as the other gentleman said, is because India has a long history and an established route to get to the refugee camp. The refugees have been pouring into India for many, many years when the war was gone. So they have an established route. In the last few years, after the war was done and over with, that number came down drastically, but it did not close. The routes did not close. So today, when these people get on a boat and get to India, it's something that they know how to do. So that's why it's happening, number one. Number two, actually that's number two, because number one, why it is happening is because there's really nothing to look forward to being in the northern part of Sri Lanka, because whatever resources are available are centered in Colombo and its suburbs. So it's centered in the Sinhalese part of Sri Lanka. The Tamil part of Sri Lanka already was restricted, already was compromised. On top of it, this pandemic hit them hard. Every resource was diverted away from them. And then now this hyperinflation is not doing any favors. So they don't have a choice. They have been second-class citizens for the longest time when the war was happening. As long as there was hope that there was some kind of autonomy going to be given to them, now that is also not there. So what choice do they have? So yes, as their umbilical cord brothers, as brothers of the same ethnicity, I do believe that Tamils have to have a very sympathetic, they have to have a sympathetic view to it. But I also have a very strong viewpoint about the government of India's standpoint. Yes, we do have neighborly duties, but I think at some point, and I know Mr. Ram will absolutely disagree with me on this, we've discussed this before in the past, I think it is time to draw some very hard lines here. I think it is time we start. Yes, right now we have to avert an economic crisis. We have to avert an economic crisis that will spill over to us and spill over globally. So yes, we do have to. I'm not saying stop all bailouts, but Sri Lanka has forever, from the day I remember, from the day I have been noticing it, Sri Lanka has been a bailout country. It has been a dole country. It has always been getting debt over credit, over credit, over credit lines. And today there is news that India and Sri Lanka are going to jointly raise another 1 billion credit line. This is not going to work for us.
Kasturi, since I have very limited time and I've run out of time on this discussion, I would say that on whether doles should be handed out or aid or whatever you may want to call it be handed out or not is a long discussion. But as of this moment, those people who are seeking help from India, I guess they need aid and assistance both. And to that, should the Indian government now very quickly have a sympathetic view I think
Ankit,
that's
they
the
need
point.
an option, and
It's
India is
very
the
clear.
only option right now.
I think that's the only option right now. Absolutely, as Mr. N. Ram also said. Thank you very much to all of you all for joining us. I think this is an important point. Very soon we must and should hear from New Delhi on what the national policy is going to be on these refugees who are fleeing from Sri Lanka. Let's now move on now to story number 2. As we discuss, a new common entrance test so that this cut-off menace of a madness of 100% is taken care of, thanks to a few boards in India who have decided to go for this crazy lenient marking. But is this new system accurate, or will it also fail on certain parameters, as our guest in just a short moment, the former Delhi University Vice Chancellor Dinesh Singh, will point out. But first, let's listen in to what the Chief of the University Grants Commission, UGC, Mamidala Jagadish Kumar, told us yesterday on why there is a need for a common entrance test in universities.
The board examination marks will only be used as the eligibility criteria for admission in UG programs. The admission in UG programs will solely be based on the CUET score in all the central universities, and we are also asking all the private universities, state universities and deemed to be universities also to adopt the CUET score for admission in their respective UG program.
So there are massive changes that have been proposed to the undergraduate system. For instance, after class 12th, the method that was followed or presumably followed was cut-off marks. Some universities had entrance tests. But now the UGC has proposed a common entrance test for all universities. To talk about this, as to whether this is the right way forward in its present form as a reform or not, I have with me the former Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, Mr. Dinesh Singh. Thank you very much, Mr. Singh, for joining us. First of all, your opinion on these changes, proposed changes.
Well, Sanket, I must tell you that in principle, it's a good idea to reform the admissions process, and that was what the National Education Policy Committee had in mind when they recommended this matter, that they could consider universities should consider a national admissions test. In principle, it is a good idea and it is required. But as usual, the devil lies in the details. I have seen no evidence in India so far, not just vis-a-vis this test that is about to be launched, but even in other tests, national tests of all kinds, any deep academic or scholarly talk and thinking behind those tests. Let me just give you an example. If you look at the IIT entrance exams, the one major upshot of these exams has been that over the years, they have messed up entirely our school education system. It's completely gone to the dogs. Nobody has given thought to this. There is grave danger that if we do this test also along the same lines, this is going to harm school education to the hilt. India needs to be wary. You can't have a double whammy. As it is, whenever students start preparing for IITs or other exams, they don't seem to pay much attention to what happens in their school exams, school studies. It isn't so much the exams as the fact that they don't pay attention to studies, to knowledge, to creativity. And the IIT entrance exam has consistently been a creativity killer. I have seen no correlation between those who do really well in the entrance exam for the IITs and how they perform in the IITs. I have only anecdotal evidence, but gathered over a large number of years, talking to many colleagues. Let's not do the same thing with this exam. That's my worry. I think we need to think carefully and do this in a very reasoned, rational and productive way.
So, Mr. Singh, if I may ask you, do you feel that it has not been done in a reasoned, rational way? And this is not reform, but merely a change? And the results of that may be catastrophic?
Yes, Sanket. So my thing is that all I've heard so far are the modalities of the test. Look, the real thing is what sort of questions are going to be asked, what is the methodology behind asking those questions, will they test ability in a genuine way, I have no evidence of that. We are just leaving it to the National Testing Agency. I respect them and they have a hard task before them, but where is the evidence so far? Maybe they have something up their sleeves which I am unaware of, and maybe that's the way it should be. But my worry is all our past records, including the NEET exam, none of them betray any confidence on my part.
I think that's a very important input that perhaps the UGC must look into. But, you know, Mr. Singh, if not this, you're saying in principle you're not opposed to the idea of this change or reform. What are those key things that you feel need to be done? For instance, when you have a common entrance test for any university, it does not take into consideration certain specific areas which in which certain expertise is required. For instance, right now, there are some universities who are carrying out entrance tests for specific courses. So do you think that this specific nature will go out of the window once you have a very common form of examination?
What little I've gathered since yesterday, probably they're going to make some provisions that will take into account specializations. But let me tell you something, Sanket. All through my school years, I wanted to be a physicist. I was good at math, but I was also good at physics and I wanted to be a physicist. I suddenly, when I entered college, I changed my mind and became a mathematician. Now my point is this. You're going to test someone for, say, biology, but the bloke may decide I really want to do history. I mean, this is too early to allow people to decide specializations. That's the other mistake they're making. I don't endorse this idea. What they have to look for is a certain ability to be creative, to think rationally, have a fair degree of general knowledge of the creative kind. I have seen no evidence in any kind of test that India has offered in the past that would betray that. And you've seen our performance in the PISA exams, the global testing exam, which tests these basic skills of students. India has performed abysmally so far. And so we need to think, where will this take school education? I'm sincerely worried. I'm not saying that this test is going to be a disaster. It may well turn out to be a great idea, but until I have the details, I need to be cautious.
Okay. You know, Mr. Singh, there are some comments on the COO app also that many students, many concerned parents seem to be raising, and let's see if you can answer some of those questions. So Gaurav on the COO app says that some boards are more generous than others in marking, and this gives their students an unfair advantage over others. In effect, he's suggesting that a common entrance exam is actually going to be good because it will take care of this quote-unquote anomaly. How would you respond to this, Mr. Singh? Because, you know, the cutoffs have been obnoxious. I mean, how can one reasonably expect to get enrolled in a Delhi University college with a 100% cutoff?
Sanket, it's not a question of cutoffs. It's a question of how do you go about getting yourself assessed. I mean, just take I'm sorry, I keep harking back to the IIT entrance exam.
Sure.
Become a convenient whipping boy, but I'm compelled to do that. Just look at the exams. They don't take into account any board performances. So let's leave the board thing aside for a moment, whether a board gives you good marks or not. Have you seen the merciless way in which students prepare for the IIT entrance? Have you seen the mad pressure that everybody puts on them? And is this a small number of students? It's a large number, very large number. And it is messing up things completely. It's not helping India's knowledge creativity. We have to think about this. Let's not fall into the same trap again with this. So yes, there is a genuine concern. Some boards have been very liberal with their marks. But you know, in trying to rectify that, let's not add another problem. There are ways out. I mean, look, even when I was Vice Chancellor, I was working hard on creating a rational system that will take into account the excesses that certain boards indulge in. I got distracted towards the last 1.5 years of my tenure with other issues that compelled me to withdraw the 4-year program, and that got left by the wayside. We had made enormous progress, and I can tell you what little we had thought about that issue, it can be sorted out, and it can be done in a gentle way at a national level to ensure that even if you come to us through your board exam, what we take into account as your performance will be something whose standards we will have prescribed and judged through random testing. and at the national level. And then the boards will have to perk up. You know, you could, let me just very quickly, if you have half a minute,
sure,
illustrate. So suppose I give a math exam which is set by a certain board. One question set in the right way comes to the board from the central body. And they must put that into the question paper. And we at the central level announce that performance through that one question. I'm just giving you an illustration, and every university can look at that performance rather than the entire marks of the maths paper. And it'll give them a very good idea. That puts away, you know, a lot of the other stress that you have, that this is a board exam, then I have to prepare for these other things. It can be blended very easily. Maybe they have thought about it. I'm not sure.
Sure.
As I said, our track record, and I'm not talking about the track record of the last 1, 2, 3, 5 years. Last
Over
40
decades.
years, 50 years, we've
Yeah.
just messing up entrance exams.
Yeah.
My fear is if you look at India from outer space one day, it will look like one big entrance examination center.
Mr. Singh, my final question, this also comes from a viewer, Parang, and he writes, are we cutting or increasing competition through common tests among students? How would you respond?
Well, on the face of it, we're probably going to increase competition.
Why do you think, Mr. Singh, my final question, that these examinations are creativity killers?
Sanket, you know, it depends on the way you ask questions. I haven't seen any deep scholarship, academic or practical. And scholarship needs to be practical also. There's no point being a scholar in some ethereal sense. The ancient Indian Mimamsa school of philosophy says so categorically, knowledge without action is meaningless. So if you have a body of scholars and some scholarship material, that should be very practice oriented. And I haven't seen anything like that when it comes to testing creativity and such things in our students.
Well, Mr. Singh, thank you so much. I think these are valuable inputs. Let's see what this CUET has to offer, and they must certainly factor in the points that you have made. Otherwise, it could very well be a creativity killer, as you're putting it. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Singh.
Thank you. Thank you.